The note wasn't on the nightstand. It was pinned to the pillowcase, a scrap of textured paper that smelled faintly of turpentine and dried lavender. I picked it up, expecting a housekeeping reminder or checkout instruction. Instead, the handwriting scrawled across the grain was jagged and urgent. It read, "I can't stop thinking about your hands." I should have been alarmed. I should have packed my bags and driven back to the city that night. But the air in that room didn't feel dangerous. It felt inevitable. I came here to fix my spirit, but I didn't know I was about to be dismantled. My life in the city was a grid. I built skyscrapers, monuments to efficiency, steel skeletons wrapped in glass that reflected the sky but never touched it. I lived by the line, the angle, the precise calculation of load and resistance. If something didn't fit, I cut it out. But you can't cut out burnout. It settles in the joints, a constant low-frequency vibration that makes a steady hand impossible. When I couldn't draw a straight line without holding my breath, I knew I had to leave. I booked the furthest place I could find from the skyline, a sprawling, weathering Victorian estate on the edge of the Atlantic, where the salt air ate through iron and the fog erased the horizon every evening. The house was everything I wasn't. It was organic, shifting, a little too loud in the wind. The floorboards groaned under my designer heels, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and breathe with the house's settling weight. I carried my luggage up the curved staircase, my knuckles white against the leather handle. I was trying to impose my own order on the space, arranging my toiletries in perfect rows on the marble vanity, aligning my laptop with the edge of the antique desk. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the floorboards groan, trying to believe I was safe here. Just me, the ocean, and the silence. Then I saw her. I was standing on the porch, staring at the gray water, when the front door banged open. She didn't walk, she stormed, a blur of motion and color against the muted landscape. Camille. She was carrying 3 large canvases, the wood frames digging into her forearms, balancing them with an effortless, careless strength that made me wince. There was a smear of cerulean blue on her cheekbone, like a bruise, and her hair was tied back in a knot that was already failing, strands escaping to whip around her face in the breeze. She wasn't precise. She was a spill. She stopped when she saw me. The canvases lowered slowly, resting on the peeling paint of the porch. She didn't smile, not exactly. She just looked. It wasn't the polite, scanning glance of a landlord checking in on a tenant. It was a study. Her eyes moved over me, taking in the sharp lines of my blazer, the rigid posture, the way I held my coffee cup like a shield against the chaotic world she inhabited. "You made it," she said. Her voice was lower than I expected, scratchy, like charcoal dragging across rough paper. "I did," I replied, my voice clipped, professional. The directions were clear. "Directions are easy," she said, wiping her hands on a rag tucked into her belt. "The road is the hard part." The air between us thickened, charged with a sudden, unexplained static. It wasn't just the humidity of the approaching storm. It was her proximity. She smelled of linseed oil and rain. She took a step closer, not invading my space, but pressing against the invisible boundary I kept around myself. She looked at my hands, still gripping the ceramic mug. "Precision," she observed, nodding as if she'd solved a puzzle. "We'll see how long that lasts here." She picked up her canvases and disappeared into the house. I retreated to my room, locking the door, convinced I could maintain my walls. I didn't realize the house itself was designed to bring them down. Sleep in that house was a negotiation I was losing. My body was exhausted, but my mind was still running diagnostics, checking the integrity of a life I'd left 300 miles away. At 2 a.m., the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the water stains in the plaster, until the itch in my fingers, that phantom vibration of stress, forced me up. I needed water. I needed motion. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. The floorboards were cool against my bare feet. Down the corridor, where the shadows usually pooled thickest, there was a break. A thin gold line of light spilled from beneath the double doors of the solarium. Camille's studio. I should have turned back. I was a guest, and guests don't wander. But the pull was physical, like a current dragging me toward the center of the storm. As I got closer, the air changed. The sterile, dusty smell of the old house gave way to something sharper, pungent linseed oil, damp earth, and the metallic tang of a storm breaking outside. Underneath, barely audible over the rain lashing the windows, was the sound of a saxophone. Slow, smoky jazz. I stopped at the threshold. One of the doors was ajar, just enough to see inside. The room was a cavern of shadows, lit only by a few clamp lights clipped to easels. Camille stood in the center of the chaos. She had changed out of her day clothes into an oversized men's shirt that hung off one shoulder, stained with a history of colors. Her arm moved in wide, sweeping arcs, attacking the surface with a brush that looked too large for the detail she was creating. She would slash a line of crimson across the fabric, then freeze, her wrist turning to feather the edge with a delicacy that made my breath catch. I watched the muscles in her back shift under the thin cotton. "You're breathing too loud," she said. She didn't turn around. She didn't stop painting. Her hand continued down the canvas, dragging a streak of ochre into the dark. The hyper-awareness hit me like a physical shove. I had been standing in the dark, silent, 10 feet away, yet she knew exactly where I was. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said, my voice sounding thin in the large room. "I couldn't sleep. Nobody sleeps here when the tide is coming in," she murmured. Finally, she lowered the brush. She turned slowly, her face shadowed, eyes catching the harsh glare of the work light. "Come here." It wasn't a request. I walked into the room, feeling the temperature rise. It was warmer here, humid with the heat of the lamps and the drying paint. I stood beside her, looking at the canvas. It was a mess of dark blues and violent grays, swirling without an anchor. "What is it?" I asked, looking for the structure. "That's the wrong question," she said softly. She stepped closer to me, wiping her hands on a rag. The smell of turpentine was intoxicatingly strong now. "You look at things to define them. You want to know where the walls are, where the load-bearing beams sit." She reached out, her hand hovering inches from my face. She didn't touch me, but I felt the heat of her palm. "You need to stop looking and start seeing," she whispered. "Looking is about control. Seeing is about letting the light hit you, even if it burns." I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Not from fear, but from the terrifying realization that she could see right through my carefully constructed walls. "Good night, Camille," I managed to say. "Good night, architect," she replied, turning back to her work before I had even left the room. I walked back to my room, the image of her hand hovering near my face burned into my retina. I lay in bed, listening to the rain, feeling more exposed in the dark than I ever had under the fluorescent lights of the city. Morning broke with a bruised purple light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains. I woke slowly, the residue of the storm still humming in the air. I reached for my phone, a reflex, an addiction to the urgent red notifications of my real life. But my fingers brushed against something else. It was texture, not glass. A small, torn square of sketch paper pinned to the pillowcase right beside my head. It smelled of charcoal and that persistent, earthy lavender that seemed to seep from the house's very bones. I sat up, clutching the sheet to my chest, and pulled the pin free. The paper was heavy, grain visible under the jagged scrawl of graphite. "I watched you drink your coffee this morning. I can't stop thinking about your hands. They look like they hold up the sky." I read it twice, then a third time. My heart did a strange, traitorous flip against my ribs. My first instinct was indignation, the architect in me assessing the breach of privacy. She watched me? When? From where? I replayed the previous morning, standing on the porch, staring at the gray horizon, gripping my mug like a lifeline. She had been there, unseen, cataloging me. But the indignation curdled quickly into something hotter, something that settled low and heavy in my stomach. "They look like they hold up the sky." I looked at my hands. Usually, I saw utility. I saw tools. I saw the calluses from drafting pens, the dryness from sanitizer, the tremor of exhaustion I was trying to hide. I saw the things that built structures, that signed contracts, that kept the world from falling apart. But I had never thought of them as beautiful. I had never thought of them as capable of holding up anything as vast and intangible as the sky. I spent the rest of the morning trying to work. I set up my laptop on the heavy oak table in the library, surrounded by dusty books and silence. I opened the blueprints for the Midtown project, a 50-story glass needle that needed my approval on the facade details. But the lines on the screen blurred. Every time I reached for my mouse, I hesitated. I was suddenly hyper-aware of the articulation of my wrist, the span of my fingers, the pale network of veins beneath the skin. I felt observed. Even in the empty room, I felt the weight of a gaze. I found myself posing, just slightly, arching a finger, smoothing the cuff of my silk shirt. It was ridiculous. I was a partner in a top firm, not a model, not a muse. But the note burned in my pocket. By afternoon, the hunger drove me to the kitchen. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing too loudly on the hardwood. Camille was there. She was leaning against the butcher block island, eating a pear with a knife, slicing pieces off with a terrifying casualness. She didn't jump when I entered. She didn't hide. "Coffee?" she asked, not looking up. "Tea," I corrected, my voice tighter than I intended. She turned to the kettle. The silence that stretched between us wasn't empty. It was heavy with expectation. It was the note, hanging in the air like smoke. She knew I had found it. She knew I had read it. And she wasn't sorry. She set the mug down in front of me. As I reached for it, she didn't pull her hand away. Her fingers brushed mine, rough, warm, stained with phthalo green. The contact lasted a fraction of a second too long, a deliberate breach of the boundary I was trying to establish. "You have a lot of tension," she murmured, her eyes dropping to my hand on the ceramic handle. "Right there, in the knuckles." "I work hard," I said, lifting the mug, willing the tremor to stay away. "I have responsibilities." "You're bracing for impact," she countered. She looked up, meeting my eyes. Her gaze was unflinching, dark and amused, stripping away the professional veneer I wore like armor. "You should be careful. Structures that don't bend tend to shatter." "And what happens if I let go?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could check it. She smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her mouth that made the breath catch in my throat. "Then you find out what's actually supporting you." She took her pear and left the room, the swing door settling shut behind her. I stood there, the steam from the tea rising around my face, feeling the architecture of my carefully ordered world beginning to groan under the weight of something new. I wasn't just a tenant paying for a view anymore. I was raw material, and she was already starting to shape me. The house developed a gravity I couldn't resist. My evenings, previously ring-fenced for conference calls and reviewing structural loads, began to bleed into the hallway and down toward the light of the solarium. I stopped pretending. I would bring a book, a dense treatise on brutalist theory, and sit in the velvet armchair in the corner of her studio. I told myself I was just reading, but I never turned the page. I was there to be near the fire. The studio hummed with a frequency that made the silence of my own room unbearable. Camille barely acknowledged me, yet she moved with a performative grace, fully aware of her audience. The smell of turpentine was sharper tonight, cutting through the humidity. "I need your hands," she said one Tuesday. The rain was a gray curtain against the glass. She didn't look up from her charcoal stick, which she was sharpening with a small knife. "Excuse me?" "My reference is flat," she said, blowing the dust off the blade. "I need structure. You have structure. Sit here." It was framed as a necessity. I set my book down and sat on the high wooden stool she indicated. She draped a piece of dark silk over a pedestal table. "Put your right hand here. Relax the wrist. Let the fingers drift." I placed my hand on the silk. It felt heavy, clumsy. I was an architect. My hands were trained to hold pens, to gesture at blueprints, to grip steering wheels. They didn't know how to drift. Camille sighed, a sharp sound of impatience. "No, you're holding it like a weapon. Soften." I tried to unclench, but the harder I tried, the more the tendons in the back of my hand stood out. She stepped out from behind the easel. The air in the room seemed to compress. She walked over to me, her boots heavy on the floorboards, and stopped inside my personal space. She smelled of rain and burnt wood. "May I?" she asked, though her hand was already reaching out. Yes, I breathed. Her hands were warm, dry, and rough like sandstone. When she touched me, my vision narrowed to the point of contact. She didn't just move my fingers. She dismantled them. Her thumb pressed into the center of my palm, working out a knot of tension I hadn't known was there. It was agonizingly slow. She lifted my index finger, curbing it inward, then the middle finger, adjusting the spacing with a terrifying precision. The friction of her skin against mine was electric, a current that bypassed my brain and went straight to my stomach. It was a violation of the professional distance I clung to, yet I leaned into it. I sat frozen, not daring to exhale. I watched her eyelashes lower as she focused on the articulation of my thumb. She was treating my hand like a sacred object, or perhaps a complex lock she was picking. There, she whispered. She didn't pull away immediately. Her hand lingered, her palm hovering over the back of mine, the heat radiating between us. Don't move. That tension. The way you're ready to snap. That's what I want. She retreated to the easel. The sound of charcoal hitting paper began, a harsh, rhythmic scratching that felt like it was happening directly on my skin. Scritch. Pause. Scritch. I watched her eyes dart from my hand to the paper, her gaze possessing me in pieces. Every time she looked up, I felt a phantom touch, a ghost of her rough fingertips tracing my veins. I realized then that this wasn't about the drawing. This was a conversation in a language I was just learning to speak. She was mapping me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to hide the blueprints. The invitation was handwritten, slipped under my door like a summons. A gallery opening in town. Camille was the feature. I prepared for it like a board meeting. I pulled the black structural suit from the back of the closet, the one I wore when I had to fire someone or close a 7-figure deal. I painted my lips a red that served as a warning sign. I needed the armor. In the studio, I was unraveling, but in public, I needed to remember who I was, or who I used to be. The gallery was a converted warehouse by the docks, smelling of cheap wine and damp wool. It was packed. The locals were loud, comfortable in their flannel and rain gear, a sea of earth tones. I cut through them like a knife. I stood near a pillar, holding a plastic cup of wine, feeling the familiar ache of being an outsider. I watched Camille across the room. She was wearing a velvet jacket that looked vintage and dangerous, her hair actually brushed. She was charming a couple of tourists, her laugh rising above the din. She looked magnetic. And she hadn't looked at me once. You must be the renter. The voice came from my left. A man, older, wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better decades. He moved into my personal space with the entitlement of a local dignitary. He smelled of pipe tobacco and old rain. I'm staying at the estate, yes, I said, my voice cool, professional. I took a step back. He took a step forward. We don't get many city types up here in the off-season, he said, his gaze dropping to my neckline before returning to my face. Awfully lonely out there on the cliffs. Big house for one woman. He reached out, his hand hovering near my elbow, a gesture that felt distinctively predatory. Let me get you a better drink. They keep the good stuff in the back. I froze. It was a reaction I hated, the polite paralysis of a woman trained to be agreeable in uncomfortable situations. I opened my mouth to decline, to sharpen my voice into a blade, but the air suddenly shifted. A hand settled on the small of my back. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was firm, warm, and possessive. It grounded me instantly, the heat of it searing through the layers of silk and wool. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The scent of turpentine washed over me. She's fine, Camille said. Her voice was low, but held a hidden razor wire. She stepped in beside me, her shoulder pressing against mine, presenting a united front. A wall. The man blinked, his hand dropping. Oh, Camille. I was just welcoming your guest. She's not a guest, Camille said, her thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle against my spine. She's with me. The man muttered an excuse and retreated into the crowd. Camille didn't move her hand. She leaned in, her lips grazing the shell of my ear, the intimacy of the gesture shocking in the crowded room. Don't worry about him, she whispered, her breath hot against my skin. He thinks chiaroscuro is a type of cured meat. I let out a laugh, a startled, genuine sound that cracked my facade. Camille pulled back, her eyes dancing with conspiracy. For the rest of the night, she didn't leave my side. She didn't have to hold me. The invisible tether was enough. The drive home was silent. The rain lashed against the windshield, sealing us in. Usually, silence made me anxious. I would fill it with radio news or mental checklists. But this silence was comfortable. It was heavy with the shared secret of the evening. I drove with one hand on the wheel, acutely aware of her presence in the passenger seat. I checked the rearview mirror. The red lipstick was smudged. I looked less like an architect and more like a woman who had just been claimed. And God help me, I didn't want to resign. The storm besieged us. By Saturday, the Atlantic was a bruised wall of water slamming against the cliffs, the wind screaming like something trying to claw inside. The power died with a sharp electric crack, plunging the house into a premature gray twilight. We were trapped. The roads were flooded, the phone lines were dead, and the world I had run away from was effectively erased. It was just the house, the roar of the wind, and the suffocating pressure of being alone with her. I found the second note by the flicker of a lighter I'd dug out of my purse. It was waiting on the bathroom vanity, propped against the cold marble. I want to know if they feel as soft as they look, or if there is steel underneath. I stared at the paper, the flame dancing in my hand, casting wild shadows against the tile. Steel. I had spent 15 years turning myself into steel, reinforcing my spine, armoring my heart, calculating the load of my own endurance. But she wasn't asking about my resilience. She was asking about my touch. She was daring me to be something other than the structure I had built. I found her in the library. She had fed the fireplace until it roared, the only source of light in the cavernous room. She sat on the Persian rug, legs drawn up, a bottle of dark wine breathing on the floor beside her. She didn't look up when I entered. She knew my footsteps by now. The hesitation, the weight. I walked to the hearth and dropped the note into her lap. It landed softly, a white flag on the dark denim of her jeans. "Is this a question?" I asked, my voice barely rising above the crackle of the logs. "Or a challenge?" Camille picked up the paper, her fingers stained with charcoal, and tossed it into the fire. We watched it curl and blacken, the words turning to ash in seconds. "It's a hypothesis," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were black pools reflecting the flames. "Sit down. You're blocking the heat." I sat. Not on the chair, but on the floor, opposite her. The distance was small, intimate. She poured wine, something deep red and heavy, into a glass and slid it across the rug toward me. We drank the wine in silence for a long time, the storm rattling the window panes, the rain lashing against the glass like shrapnel. "I can't paint," she admitted suddenly. The confession was rough. I stand there, and the canvas feels resistant. I'm used to chaos. I'm used to the spill. But lately, she gestured at the space between us. All I see is structure. I see the architecture of you, the lines of your neck, the way you hold your breath, the precise way you organize your silence. You're ruining my mess. My breath caught. "I can leave," I said, the offer hollow, even to my own ears. "Don't be stupid," she snapped, but there was no heat in it. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I don't want you to leave. I want to know what happens when the building falls down. Who are you, architect, when you aren't holding everything up?" I looked into the fire. The question stripped me bare, more than any touch could have. "I don't know," I whispered. "I'm afraid that without the work, without the steel, I'm just empty space." Camille didn't offer comfort. She didn't try to fill the void with platitudes. She just watched me, her gaze heavy and physical, touching the raw places I had just exposed. "Empty space isn't just nothing," she murmured, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest. "It's room for something else." The air between us was heavy, a physical weight pressing us toward the center. We hadn't touched, not really, but in the flickering light, I felt entirely, devastatingly held. The storm broke eventually, leaving the world scoured clean and unnervingly bright. But inside the house, the pressure hadn't equalized. If anything, the air was tighter, vibrating with the things we had almost said by the fire. I found myself wandering back to the studio the next afternoon, drawn by the silence. Camille was there, staring at a blank canvas as if it were an adversary she had to wrestle to the ground. She didn't look at me when I entered, but her shoulders tensed, a subtle realignment of her body toward my presence. "I need you again," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand, stripped of politeness. "Not just the hands this time. All of you. Sit." She pointed to the velvet armchair, now bathed in a harsh, unforgiving shaft of afternoon sunlight. I sat. I didn't smooth my skirt. I didn't cross my legs. I just sat, feeling the light heat the side of my face, feeling the weight of her gaze land on me like a physical touch. The session was grueling. It wasn't like the quick sketches. This was a siege. For hours, the only sounds were the aggressive friction of bristles against canvas and the sharp intake of her breath when a line didn't land right. I watched her work. She was ferocious, mixing colors on her palette with a violence that seemed disproportionate to the act of painting. She would paint, then curse under her breath, grabbing a rag to scrub the surface violently, erasing hours of work in seconds. She was looking for something she couldn't find. She was looking for me, but I was right there. "Stop moving," she snapped, though I hadn't moved a muscle. You're shifting, even when you're still." "I'm breathing, Camille," I said quietly. "Stop that too," she muttered, attacking the canvas again. The tension in the room ratcheted up until it was a high-pitched whine in my ears. Finally, she lowered her arm, letting out a sharp breath of frustration. She stood there, chest heaving, hands covered in a chaotic mix of Prussian blue and alizarin crimson, staring at the painting with a look of utter defeat. "It's wrong," she whispered. "It's all structure. It's all surface." I stood up. The breach of protocol felt massive. The model is supposed to be furniture, silent and still. But I walked across the room, my heels clicking on the paint-splattered floorboards. I stood beside her and looked at the canvas. It wasn't a portrait, not in the way I understood them. There was no clear line of my jaw, no precise rendering of my eyes. It was a storm. It was a collision of sharp architectural lines being swallowed by washes of deep, bruising color. It was chaotic, terrifying, and undeniably beautiful. It looked like a skyscraper collapsing into the ocean. It looked like how I felt. "You didn't paint me," I said, my voice trembling. "You painted the crash." "I can't paint you," she said, her voice raw. She turned to me, and the desperation in her eyes was terrifying. "I try to find the edges, but you keep bleeding into everything else. I'm ruining it." She held up her hands, displaying the mess of paint, the stains that went deep into her cuticles. "I ruin everything I touch. That's what I do. I make messes." I looked at her hands. They were the opposite of mine. Mine were scrubbed, manicured, smelling of expensive lotion and control. Hers were a history of every color she'd ever touched. They were dirty. They were created. "You think this is ruining?" I asked. "Look at it," she gestured to the canvas. "It's a disaster." "It's the most honest thing I've ever seen," I countered. I reached out. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, to voluntarily step into the mess. I took her hands in mine. The cold, wet paint slicked against my palms immediately. The blue and red smeared onto my skin, staining the pristine cuffs of my white shirt. I interlaced our fingers, watching the colors bleed together, my pale skin disappearing under her chaos. "You aren't ruining anything," I whispered, stepping closer until the smell of turpentine and sweat filled my lungs. "You're just showing me what's underneath." She looked down at our joined hands, her breath hitching. The contrast was gone. We were both stained now. I squeezed her hand, feeling the grit of the pigment, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to wash it off. I wanted to see how deep the color would go. The moment our hands locked, the physics of the room changed. Gravity shifted. It wasn't just about the mess anymore. It was about the anchor. Camille didn't pull away. The paint was slick and cold between our palms, a messy, chaotic seal that bound us together. But the heat radiating from her was searing. She stepped in, closing the final inches of distance that I had spent weeks trying to maintain. She lowered her head, and when her forehead rested against mine, the air left my lungs in a rush. It was a grounding I hadn't known I was starving for. I closed my eyes. The sensory input was a flood. The sharp chemical bite of turpentine, the damp wool of the storm, the lingering ghost of her perfume, something like amber and old paper. I could hear the rain tapering off on the roof, but louder than that was the sound of our own breathing, ragged and out of sync, trying to find a shared rhythm. She shifted her grip, her hands sliding up my wrists, leaving streaks of alizarin crimson on my skin. She turned my palm over, her thumb digging into the soft flesh of the mount, tracing the lines there. She wasn't just holding me, she was reading me. "So many straight lines," she whispered, her breath hot against my face. "You've built so many walls." "I had to," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "And now? Now I don't know where the door is." She pulled back just enough to look at me. Her eyes were dark, dilated, searching my face for a structural weakness she could exploit. She found it. She leaned in, and the kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision. It was slow, deliberate, a question asked and answered in the same heartbeat. It tasted of wine and inevitability. There was a texture to it, a roughness that matched her hands, a demand that I stop thinking and start feeling. I felt the precise weight of her intention. It wasn't soft. It was heavy. It pressed the air out of me and replaced it with her. My hands, usually so steady, so capable of drawing perfect angles, were shaking as they found purchase on her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left for the architecture of my old life. We didn't let go. We ended up on the floor, sitting amidst the wreckage of her artistic frustration, the tossed brushes, the paint-stained rags. I sat with my back against the heavy wooden easel, and she sat with me, her head resting on my shoulder, her legs tangled with mine. It was undignified. It was messy. It was the most comfortable I had ever been. We stayed there as the night deepened, the candles burning down to pools of wax on the floorboards. We talked in low murmurs, the kind of conversation you can only have in the dark. I told her about the city, not the skyline I built, but the crushing weight of the expectations that held it up. I told her about the shaking in my hands. She listened, her fingers idly tracing the veins in my wrist, painting invisible lines over the real ones. She told me about the fear of the blank canvas, the terror that the chaos inside her would never find a way out. "You ground me," she said quietly, her voice vibrating against my collarbone. "You're the straight line I can't draw." "You ruined my shirt," I whispered back, looking at the blue stains on the silk. "I improved it," she corrected. We fell silent as the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the skylights. It was a cold, revealing light. It washed over the studio, turning the shadows back into furniture and easels. It fell on my hands, still interlaced with hers, the dried paint cracking like old earth. For a moment, I thought we could stay suspended in this amber, this safe harbor. But the light brought the world back. My phone, left on the work table, buzzed. A single, short vibration. A calendar notification. I looked at it, then at Camille. The notification was for my train, the departure date I had booked weeks ago. The real world wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the sun to come up. The phone buzzed against the wood, a mechanical insect invading the sanctuary. I answered it. I didn't mean to. My hand moved with a muscle memory honed by 15 years of precision. It was the senior partner, calling from 300 miles away. His voice was jagged, the Meridian Tower, a load-bearing calculation flagged during the final audit. A liability, a disaster. He needed me in the city. I hung up. The silence that rushed back wasn't peaceful. It was judgmental, a heavy thing that filled the spaces between the easels. Camille was standing by the window, watching the dawn light hit the ocean. She didn't look at me. She had heard the shift in my voice, the way the softness had evaporated, replaced by the clipped, metallic cadence of the architect. "I have to go," I said. It sounded like an apology, but felt like resignation. "Go," she said without turning. Her voice was flat, stripped of the texture I had grown addicted to. The skyline won't hold itself up. She didn't ask me to stay. If she had fought, if she had thrown a brush or shouted, I might have found a reason to argue. But she treated my departure as a foregone conclusion, a natural law, like gravity. The vacation was over. She was already putting her walls back up, brick by brick.
Packing felt like an amputation.
I moved through the room, stripping the bed, folding the silk shirts, placing toiletries back into designated compartments. With every item, the room became less mine and more hers again. I was erasing myself. I turned the water to scalding. I scrubbed the paint from my hands, scouring the swirls until they vanished down the drain and my skin was pink, raw, clean. Camille didn't come to the door. I walked down the hallway one last time, my suitcase wheels thumping a heavy, final rhythm on the floorboards. The studio door was closed. I didn't knock. I couldn't bear to see her look at me with that knowing, resigned expression, the one that said she knew I would choose the steel over the storm. I threw my bag into the passenger seat. As it landed, a piece of paper fluttered out from where it had been tucked into the leather handle. The third note. I picked it up. Stiff paper, smelling of charcoal and rain. Go build your skyscrapers, but remember what it felt like to just hold something. I stared at the words until they blurred. I shoved the note into my pocket and started the car. I drove away, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just a smudge of gray against the cliffs, swallowed by the fog rolling in off the Atlantic. The road to the station wound through the pines. I gripped the wheel at 10 and 2. I looked at my hands. They were steady. They were clean, the cuticles scrubbed free of blue, the nails manicured to perfection. They were ready to sign contracts, to point at blueprints, to shake hands with men in expensive suits who didn't know the color of alizarin crimson. Perfect tools for labor, but they looked dead. I reached the intersection, left to the highway, right to the station. I idled there, the engine humming. I thought about the corner office, the view from the 50th floor, where the people look like ants and you can't hear the rain hitting the glass. I thought about the charcoal dust on my pillow. I thought about the studio heat and the dust motes at 2 a.m. For the last month, I hadn't looked at a single straight line. The city offered me a legacy of glass and steel. It offered prestige. But the house offered me a pulse. I looked at my hands one last time. They didn't want to hold up the sky anymore. They just wanted to get dirty. I spun the wheel. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, shattering the quiet morning. I didn't look at the GPS. I knew the way back. The gravel driveway crunched loudly under my tires, a sound that felt less like an arrival and more like a correction. I left the car door open, the engine ticking in the cool air. I walked toward the porch with the deliberate, heavy cadence of someone returning to the only place that mattered. The front door was unlocked. The house was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. It was bruised, vibrating with the recent violence of my departure. I followed the scent of turpentine and distress down the hall. The studio was bathed in the heavy amber light of the golden hour. The shadows were long and distorted, stretching across the floorboards like reaching fingers. Camille was there. She stood before the easel, her back rigid, a palette knife gripped in her hand like a weapon. She wasn't painting. She was scraping. She was systematically destroying the canvas, carving thick, angry furrows through the drying paint, erasing the storm she had struggled so hard to capture. She thought the muse had left the building. She thought the structure had collapsed. She was wrong. I crossed the expansive room, my heels striking the wood with a rhythm she should have recognized. I didn't speak. I reached out and grabbed her wrist. My grip was firm, architectural precision applied to human bone. She froze. The knife hovered inches from the canvas, trembling. She turned slowly, her eyes wide, dark, and guarded. She looked at my hand on her wrist, anchoring her chaos, then up at my face. She was waiting for an explanation. She was waiting for me to tell her I had forgotten my charger, or that the trains were delayed. I quit everything, I said. It wasn't a speech. It was a structural fact. 3 words that carried more weight than any skyscraper I had ever designed. I called them from the car. I quit the firm. I quit the city. I quit the straight lines. Camille let out a breath that sounded like a sob. The palette knife clattered to the floor, leaving a smear of Prussian blue on the wood. You're staying? I'm staying, I confirmed. I realized I don't want to hold up the sky anymore. I want to be here, on the ground, with you.
The tension in the room didn't dissolve.
It shattered. She stepped into me, burying her face in the crook of my neck. Her hands, still covered in wet paint and frustration, gripped the back of my clean blazer. I didn't care about the silk. I held her, feeling the solid, messy reality of her against me. We stood there until the sun dipped below the horizon, holding on to each other like we were the only two things in the world that weren't falling apart. The relief was physical, a sudden unspooling of the tight coil in my chest.
Later, we stood side by side, looking at the painting.
It was scarred from her attempt to destroy it, slashed with lines of raw canvas where the knife had cut through the illusion.
"It's ruined," she murmured, tracing a deep gouge with her pinky.
I destroyed the composition. "No," I said, pointing to where the scrape revealed a layer of bright crimson underneath the turbulent gray. "It's honest. You found the steel underneath. You found the part that survives the crash." She looked at me then, a slow smile touching her lips. She took my hand and placed it on the easel shelf, interlacing her fingers with mine. My hand was clean, pale, steady. Hers was a riot of color, stained with the evidence of her labor. Together, resting against the wood, they finally looked like a completed work. It has been 6 months since I turned the car around. The city feels like a story someone else told me, a distant memory of glass and noise. I still wake up early, but now, instead of checking emails, I check the light on the water. My hands are different. They aren't just tools for precision anymore. They are always slightly stained with charcoal dust, learning the messy, imperfect art of sketching what I feel. If you have ever found a love that forced you to burn the blueprints and rewrite your entire life, subscribe and tell me in the comments. I want to know what you built in the ashes.